What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Wrestling Decoded. And today we're covering stories that share one specific quality. Every single one of them was actively kept from the public at the time it happened, and most of them only emerged because someone, years later, decided the truth was more interesting than the silence. WWE is exceptionally good at controlling its own narrative. It owns its footage, it shapes its own history, and it has decades of practice deciding which version of events reaches its audience. So today we're going through the stories that slipped through that control, the ones WWE genuinely never wanted you to know, and explaining exactly why each one was buried in the first place. Let's get into it. If you're into these real, fully documented deep dives into wrestling's most carefully guarded secrets, that's exactly what this channel does. Go ahead and subscribe before we start. The first story on this list wasn't supposed to survive a single news cycle, let alone become one of the most documented moments in wrestling history. The original plan for the 1997 Survivor Series, from WWE's perspective, was for the Montreal Screwjob to be presented to the public as a clean, legitimate finish. Shawn Michaels won the championship, the referee called the match, end of story. What WWE did not account for was the existence of a documentary film crew following Bret Hart throughout that period, shooting footage that would eventually become Wrestling with Shadows. That camera crew was in the building that night, and the footage they captured, Hart's real reaction backstage, the genuine chaos immediately following the match, the confrontation between Hart and McMahon that ended with McMahon being punched, made it functionally impossible for WWE to control the narrative the way it initially intended. The documentary aired before WWE could establish a clean public version of events, and the story became permanent wrestling history before any official response could fully shape how it was received. The detail that rarely gets discussed is what WWE's initial public position on the Montreal Screwjob actually was. McMahon's first statements attempted to frame the finish as a legitimate creative decision rather than a premeditated betrayal, a position that became increasingly difficult to maintain as more witnesses came forward. The decision to eventually lean into the Mr. McMahon character, publicly owning what had happened as a demonstration of his own power, was as much a damage control calculation as it was a creative one. If the story is coming out regardless, make it part of the show. Here's a question worth sitting with. How many other moments in WWE history do you think were similarly reframed as intentional creative decisions after the real version of events became impossible to fully suppress? The second story connects directly to how WWE has historically handled performer health information, and it's one that the company genuinely preferred to keep internal for years. During the build to their Hell in a Cell match in 2022, Cody Rhodes suffered a torn pectoral tendon that eventually tore completely off the bone, a legitimate serious injury that required major surgery. WWE's public statements about the injury in the lead-up to the match were minimal and carefully worded. Rhodes competed anyway, wrestling through one of the most physically demanding match types in WWE's catalog while genuinely injured at a level that most athletes would consider disqualifying. The full extent of the injury only became widely understood after photographs taken during the match circulated publicly, showing the visible bruising and physical damage in stark terms that WWE's vague pre-match language hadn't conveyed. Why does this qualify as a story WWE never wanted fully told? Because the full picture, a performer competing through a catastrophic injury because the company needed him to, raises questions about performer welfare and the kind of pressure, spoken or unspoken, that exists in WWE's environment around missing scheduled appearances. Rhodes has been open in subsequent interviews about the personal decision to compete, framing it as his own choice, which it may genuinely have been. But the institutional context around that choice is something WWE has never been particularly interested in examining publicly. Third on this list is a story that WWE has actively worked to remove from its own documented history, the complete erasure of Chris Benoit from official WWE programming and archives following June 2005. The decision itself is understandable given the circumstances, a genuine tragedy that required an immediate and comprehensive response. What makes this qualify as a story WWE never wanted fully told is the internal detail that's emerged in the years since about how the days immediately following were handled within the company. Multiple performers have described learning about the situation through unofficial channels rather than any formal company communication, arriving at venues without clear information, and being expected to perform on programming that initially aired a tribute before the full circumstances were understood. The gap between WWE's public response and the internal experience its performers actually had in those days represents one of the most significant disconnects between official narrative and reality in company history. Quick pause here. Drop a comment on which of these stories you think WWE worked hardest to keep contained, because I think the answer is less obvious than it might initially seem. The fourth story on this list is one that WWE successfully kept almost entirely quiet for years, only emerging through the court system rather than through the kind of voluntary disclosure that might have allowed the company to shape the narrative. WWE's long-running legal and contractual dispute with various independent contractors over the question of performer classification, specifically whether wrestlers working full-time schedules and traveling with WWE should have been legally classified as employees with associated benefits rather than as independent contractors, produced court filings that contained internal company documents most executives would have preferred to keep private indefinitely. The details that emerged through that litigation process about how WWE structured its compensation agreements and how it understood its own relationship with the performers on its roster told a significantly different story than the company's public statements about talent relationships had consistently suggested. The fifth story is one that WWE has never officially addressed at all, which is itself a form of suppression, the full scope of what happened to careers that were quietly killed rather than officially ended. Every wrestling fan knows about the high-profile exits and the documented releases, but the more interesting story, the one WWE has never had any interest in telling, is about the performers whose momentum was deliberately slowed or redirected at specific moments for reasons that had nothing to do with their own performance. Multiple performers across different eras have described in their own autobiographies and podcast appearances specific instances where they were told their push was being changed without any explanation offered, arriving at television tapings to discover their planned segments had been removed without discussion, or finding their character direction reversed mid-storyline in ways that never made creative sense. The through line in most of these accounts points to the same basic institutional reality. In a company where one person historically made every significant creative decision, the difference between a main event push and a mid-card plateau was often simply whether or not that person happened to find your particular character compelling in that specific moment. The sixth story sits at the intersection of real-world politics and wrestling business in a way WWE has never publicly acknowledged, the genuine extent of how much the Monday Night War's competitive pressure affected decisions about which performers got pushed at what times. Multiple creative decisions from the 1996 through 2001 period that WWE has since presented as purely creative judgments were directly influenced by the need to counter specific WCW moves rather than by any assessment of which storyline was most organically compelling at the time. Steve Austin's rocket push in 1996 and 1997 was genuinely merit-based and fan-driven, but the specific timing of several championship decisions around that same period was influenced as much by what WCW was doing the same week as by what WWE's own internal creative logic suggested. That context doesn't diminish the quality of the programming produced. It's arguably the best sustained creative output WWE has ever delivered. But the full story of how much of it was reactive rather than planned is one WWE has never had any particular incentive to tell honestly. And the final story on this list is the one that represents the clearest example of WWE successfully suppressing something for the longest period before it finally emerged, the full documented history of its wellness policy's early implementation, specifically the gap between when the policy was officially announced and when it was consistently enforced. Multiple performers from that era have described knowing about violations among roster members that went unaddressed in the policy's early years, a disconnect between the public presentation of the policy as a meaningful health intervention and the internal reality of how consistently it was actually applied. The policy has since become substantially more rigorous and is generally regarded as a genuine improvement in how WWE approaches performer health. But the early chapter of that story, the distance between announcement and implementation, is one the company has never examined publicly. So here's the actual pattern connecting every single one of these stories. WWE suppresses information, not primarily through active deception, though that has occasionally been part of it, but primarily through silence, through the control of its own footage and archives, and through the institutional advantage of being the party that decides which version of history gets officially documented. Most of these stories emerged anyway, through court filings, documentary footage, performer autobiographies, and podcast interviews decades after the fact, which suggests that wrestling's real history is always there, just waiting for someone with enough distance from the moment to decide that the truth is finally worth telling. Which of these stories do you think WWE worked hardest to keep quiet? Let me know down in the comments. And if you want more of these real documented deep dives into wrestling's most carefully guarded secrets, make sure you're subscribed to Wrestling Decoded. There's plenty more of this still to uncover.